Driving, 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 music's blaring in my ears. Engines roaring, 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 the horizon's drawing near. Pedal to the floor, no more feet in the door. Gonna drive right out of this bitter night.
Welcome to Nonprofit Insider. My name is David Unger, and I'm pleased to be hosting a show with executive directors and key people of local nonprofits. I have worked in the nonprofit world for over 30 years. In those years, I've realized that the majority of the community does not know about the organizations that provide critical services we sometimes take for granted. Most times, they only hear about these important groups when we get a letter in the mail asking us for money. This is a chance to hear about the organizations that touch so many in our community. The opinions expressed on Nonprofit Insider are not necessarily those of WMPG, its staff and underwriters, or of USM. Today we have Susan Lamb, Executive Director of the Maine chapter of National Association of Social Workers, or NASW. Hi, Susan.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Welcome to Nonprofit Insider.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It's a pretty gloomy day outside. What a better place to be than on live radio right now,
Absolutely.
Right? So, National Association of Social Workers, Maine chapter. What is that?
So we are not a 501c3, a charitable institution. We're a 501c6, and that's a professional association. If you were going to talk about like entities, you might think of the Maine Medical Society. They're not a charitable organization. They're a professional association of physicians. We're a professional association of social workers. So
you sit around and ask each other how you feel? I'm a social worker, so I'm allowed to say that.
Someone to call me up and ask me how I feel sometime. That would be great. Well, no, but what we do is we take care of the professional needs of our members. And as an aside, we also take care of the professional needs of many social workers who are not our members and are not contributing to our organization, something that sometimes irks our members, but there you have it. You know, we have certain ethical obligations to make sure people are steering their ship in the right directions. And when they call and they have a problem, we try to provide them with an appropriate answer.
Right. So one of the most common questions that I hear about professional associations out there in the real world is they say, well, are you a union of social workers?
No, we're not a union. And I've even had a few people tell me they won't be members because we're not a union. We're not formed in a way that would make union appropriate because social workers work for so many different entities in so many different organizations and in so many different ways. So you have social workers who work in hospitals, you have social workers who work in VA centers, you have social workers who work in schools. My sister's a school social worker, for instance. You have social workers who are in private practice. A great deal of our members are in private practice. You have social workers who work for mental health agencies and social workers who work for drug and alcohol abuse treatment centers and social workers who work in homeless shelters. So you can see we're scattered.
Right. And then you have a whole nother sect of social workers like myself who aren't in the clinical world at all, but in community organization and development.
Absolutely. And in fact, those are some of my favorites, the people who do community organizing. I think of the social workers over at Maine Equal Justice Partners who spend their lives working for socioeconomic balance for low-income people, and that's pretty nifty work that they're doing over there.
So, as the executive director of the Maine chapter, what kind of problems do you face, does the organization face? Because you're really part of a national group.
Yeah. So the best way to explain it is that there are about 55 NASW entities, and most of them are state associations. So there's the Maine Association of Social Workers and the New Hampshire Association of Social Workers. But then you get into a few that don't fit in with a state organization. For instance, the International Association of Social Workers was disbanded because it was just too small and fragmented, and it's run differently now. But New York City has an association of social workers that's separate from New York State because it's both are too large to be one single organization. And so you have some like that. And then you have Puerto Rico. I always want to get the Virgin Island jobs. Nobody calls me for that. But there is a job running the Virgin Islands Association of Social Workers. And I'm waiting for that call.
Okay, well, I'll put your name in the hat. Okay.
Thank you.
But what's it like being the executive director of a state organization like this?
So I do everything. I take out the trash. I write the copy for the newsletter that comes out every 2 months. I am thrilled when somebody volunteers to write an article for me, because otherwise I'm producing all the copy. I sell all the advertisements in our newsletter that help to pay for its distribution. We're largely electronically distributed at this point. I organize we have an ad campaign for social work jobs, which is really working out very well. And that is that I have a database of all the social workers in Maine, plus our membership database, plus I have the LCPC database. Now,
The LCPC.
Licensed Clinical Professional
Okay.
Counselors. So there's only about 1,000 of them, and there's, more like 4,500 social workers in the state. But they have to take many of the same classes we do in continuing education. So I happen to have those databases because when we offer a continuing education program somewhere in the state, I want them to know as well and sign up for it, because most of our income comes from our members who are paying dues, and the dues for a bachelor's degree in social work is only $125 a year, but for a master's degree in social work, it's $190. The student rates are well under $100. They're dirt cheap.
Right.
And we tell people, join when you're a student, because you have 2 years of gradually increasing rates before you get hit with the full membership rate. But in order to sustain ourselves and keep going, we also have to make some money on continuing education. And I make some money on advertising, both in our newsletter and in this little thing we've just started recently called a jobs program. So an example of that would be a mental health agency in Portland calls me up and says, we have the need for a social worker or an LCPC to work in this particular field. And I say, great, I'll run a one-time email ad. And I headline them jobs, jobs, jobs. I run only one a day, so that nobody's competing with anybody else. Social workers all over the state open them up. Even if they're not looking for a job, they open them up because they have friends who are looking for a job.
Or you never know.
Or you never know when the really honey job that you've been hoping for comes up.
Right.
And so we do that. It makes us money. We've been hearing back from the agencies that they've been really happy with the number of applicants they're getting and the quality of
Good.
applicants they're getting. But the most fun part is when I hear back from somebody who applied for a job and got it.
That puts it all in
That's
the...
great.
That's it.
I need my social workers employed.
So let's talk a little bit, because you are a membership-based organization, the concept of values and benefits probably comes into play. Mm-hmm. So what kind of value and benefit would a social worker get by joining NASW?
So there's sort of about 3 or 4 principal values. Number one, you get me, and I don't mean to be inflate my value, but I do a lot of lobbying during the legislative session so that we pass legislation that adheres to social work values. I do my lobbying direct from Social Work Speaks, which is our national compendium of social work positions on legislative issues. And so you get me doing that all session long. And we have some losses, but amazingly, even in this time of a split between the legislature and the governor, we've had a number of remarkable and good wins. So you get that. You get really good insurance at a really cheap rate. And that matters if you, A, have stuff, and B, like what you have. Because any social worker...
You mean practice insurance?
Practice insurance, because any
Okay.
social worker could be sued at any time. And prior to lawsuits, you can be taken before the board. And people think, well, that's not a big deal. I'll get taken before the board. You don't go before the board without a lawyer unless you're just really overconfident, let's say.
Right.
So this insurance would cover you for having an attorney represent you when you go before the Board of Licensure. And that's your first line of defense to your professional livelihood and your professional reputation. So we like to tell people, if you get called before the board, don't go in naked. Go
Right.
in with a lawyer. And then if you lose at the board level, then there's likely to be a lawsuit, and you're going to need a lawyer then. And if you start paying lawyers $200-300 an hour out of pocket, you're going to be sorry very quickly. So the insurance is fantastic. And it gives people, as I say to people, do you have stuff, A, and do you like what you have, B?
Right.
And if that's the case, you need the insurance. So that's a separate thing that you purchase through us, but it's very affordable for NASW members. And then a third benefit that's very important is that in order to keep practicing social work, you need to keep your skills up. And there are certain courses that are required of you, but also you have to have an ongoing, I think it's 24 credits every 2 years in courses that advance your learning. And of that, 4 courses have to be 4 credit, what do you call them?
CEUs.
CEUs.
Right.
Continuing education units, which stand for hours. So you have to have 4 hours of ethics every 2 years. I think that's really critically important. Social workers promote ethics in a big way, and ethics is a huge part of the practice. That's another benefit you get when you are a member of NASW, and even when you're not a member, because we're such, and I know some states where they will not serve non-members. But when you get into an ethical conundrum and you have a question, you can call me up. I'm going to put you in touch with our ethics chair, and you're going to get great advice on where to proceed.
Without using any names, while we were doing our sound check, I gave you an example of a social worker who called National.
Yes.
And they got very frustrated by it because they go look at my website. So any social worker in the state of Maine should call you first before they call National?
Yeah. National has a legal line that's open 2 days a week. They'll try to call people back. But if I get the heads up first, I'm going to call the lawyers at National and say, you need to talk to, and I'll just come up with a name, Nancy Jones,
Right.
who has an issue and needs somebody to walk them through what the best thing to do in this situation is.
Okay, great. How many social workers do you think there are in the state of Maine?
It's about 4,500 social workers.
It seems to me that there's a lot of social workers for a state this size.
I'd like to see, it's interesting. Commissioner Mayhew apparently made that statement publicly some time ago.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
And I was really curious about that because the state of Maine itself does not have enough social workers in child welfare. And we've done favors for the state of Maine, like letting them come to our conference and have a table at a very discounted rate because they don't have enough social workers in child
But there seems to be a lot of
protection.
private practice social
A lot of
work.
private practice social workers, and some are full-time and some are part-time, and some are semi-retired. Certainly that's true, but there's a lot of people with problems.
Right.
And
No
so,
question.
The market will bear only what it'll bear. If people can't make a living doing this, they move on to something else. So I would say that we have 3 schools that within the university system that are putting out social workers. Plus we have, so there's a social work program at UMPI, University of Maine at Presque Isle. There's a program at Orono, both bachelor's and master's degree program. There's a program here at USM, bachelor's and master's degree program. And then you've got University of New England, bachelor's and master's degree program. And then there are many people in Maine who decide to get their MSW, and they get down to either Boston College or BC or, Boston College or BU or Simmons and get their
Right.
advanced degrees there, and they commute.
Right.
And they're weekend students in these places. So there are a number of places to work on getting your advanced degree, both within the University of Maine system and outside of it. And there seems to be a very unlimited need for social workers.
All right. So every week at this time, we ask our guest a trivia question.
Uh-oh, now I'm in trouble.
You're in trouble. And I have to admit, only one person so far has gotten it correct.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't try and trick you, and we try and put it in perspective to what you do.
Okay.
So this week's trivia question is, who is Jane Addams? This is Nonprofit Insider on WMPG on 90.9. And today we're talking to Susan Lamb, who's the executive director of the Maine chapter of NASW.
So I know who Jane Addams is.
She's not your neighbor, is she?
No, she's not my neighbor. No, and in some ways she'd be considered the mother of social work. But she started, and I'm not going to remember the name of the first house, but she started shelter houses for impoverished people
You
in
mean the
cities.
U.S. Settlement House?
Yeah, settlement houses. I was looking for... So the first one was Hull House. And she is the person who started Hull House. and it became a model for what to do with very poor people who had nowhere to live. Believe it or not, homelessness was a problem even a century ago. And the purpose of Hull House was to not only teach people skills for working and give them a sheltered place to live, but also skills for living. So people were taught how to cook. People were taught how to properly care for their children. They were taught standards for cleanliness. It was a holistic approach to lifting people out of poverty.
Have we shifted, or are we still on those basic tenets?
We still need a lot of that. And actually, if I could take a moment, I would talk to you about somebody who did that very effectively, who's just retired. So
I guess so. Go ahead.
Down in York County, you have Dawn Jean, who just retired from running York County shelters. And when you think of a shelter, you think of a place where people go to spend the night, and then they're kicked out during the day, and then they come back and get in line and hopefully get a bed the next night. Don didn't run his shelter that way. It was in a very isolated place in Alfred, Maine, up on a hill. He'd leased a bunch of space for next to no money, and I mean literally probably $1 from the brothers up there that had apple orchards and a lot of physical plant. And he probably did this some 30 years ago, and I'm guessing when he began. And he grew this into the kind of organizations where not only could people go and stay at the shelter, but they were never turned away. They started a food bank there as well. And as he said, anybody who could make it up the hill in Alfred could have food from the food bank. We didn't question their integrity. If they needed food, they needed food. And then what he started doing was buying up apartment buildings in Biddeford and Saco and Sanford and creating housing so that he could move people from the shelters into this housing. He happened to have hired a whole bunch of social workers. He vastly underpaid them, but what he did do is he told them all, this is burnout work. You have to take 6 weeks vacation a year. And his staff stayed with him for decades because they loved the work, they loved him, and they built this housing. And when it would first be announced that that York County Shelters was buying a house in your neighborhood, the neighbors got up in arms and they were appalled that there were going to be these low-income people living there. And then 6 months later, when they saw how that dump of a building had been transformed into a gorgeous place, suddenly the neighbors loved York County Shelters and wanted them to buy the other building down the street and put some more low-income people in there. And he did creative things, like if there were single women who were alone who were not so good at child care, he would put them in a large apartment with many bedrooms with a single woman who was really good at child care, so they could learn from one another.
It's everything you read about in the textbooks, that the way you should.
How it should be done. And I'm very sad he retired this year. We named him our Public Citizen of the Year. We're about to give him that recognition down here in Portland sometime in June. And very excited about, they didn't provide a one-night solution. They provided a continuum of care. And I remember taking a tour of his place, and he said to me, Susan, the worst thing in the world that I see is when I come to work in the morning and I see kids leaving the Quonset hut that is our shelter to go wait for the school bus. He said, my job is to make sure they're in an apartment as soon as possible because no kid should live in a Quonset hut.
So, as a social worker and the person leading the social workers throughout the state, what do you see as the largest problem facing the state?
Well, first I have to correct you. I'm not personally a social worker. They hired me because I was a political activist.
I stand corrected.
Well, and I'm one of only 4 social workers in the country who...
You would just
4
assume.
members. Yeah, I'm one of only 4 executive directors in the country who's not a personally a social worker. And we went to a national meeting one time, and they gave us all painters' hats with social workers. So I'm an honorary social worker.
Okay, that works.
So I've got a little painter's hat that says social worker to prove it. But the biggest problem Maine has is poverty. It's really true. We're an old state and we're a poor state. And we work on a lot of things that would surprise people. One of the things we spent a lot of time working on is getting access to dental care. And you'd think, what are social workers doing getting access to dental care? Why aren't we more concerned with access to mental health care? Well, access to mental health care around the state is pretty reasonable. There is a number of providers in most communities, but there's a shortage of dentists in this state, and the cost of dental care is, beyond the moon for most low-income people. And the truth is that if you have rotten-looking teeth, you can't get a job. You
Right.
can't get out of poverty. So I had my Legislative Action Committee tell me, you're going to work on every bill that creates access to dental care for low-income people. And I have, in my 4 years here, worked on every bill that creates access to dental care for low-income people. And then I've personally watched it happen. I've experienced seeing people who are low income, who don't have teeth, who can't afford dentures, who can't even afford to have bad teeth removed, and how much that traps them in poverty. And we really, as a state,
And
need
you
to
never
address
think
that.
about it like that.
You don't think about it that way. You blame people for having bad teeth when often what they've had is no medical care their whole life, and it just manifests itself in their mouth first.
And I believe it was Maine Biz recently had an article about the shortage of dentists.
Absolutely. And, you know, part of the solution is the University of New England's opening a dental school, but I want to tell you that's not the whole solution. And I know this personally because for many years my husband happens to have had a few apartments, and he rented to medical students. And the medical students came and they went to medical school at UNE, and then they left.
Right.
They went back to where they came from. So a better idea, in my humble opinion, would be if we would open a dental school, and we would, and two things. One, we need to expand what not just denturists, but what dental hygienists are allowed to do in their practice.
Right.
We need to give them some autonomy because it's more important that somebody gets seen than that they get not seen by a dentist who's not available. So there's the expanded hygienist practice, which we worked on really hard this year, and the bill passed, and I'm happy to say that. It's a limited expansion, but it's a start because there are a lot more hygienists in Maine than there are dentists. The second thing we need to think about seriously is opening a dental school. And I mean the University of Maine, because if the University of Maine opens a dental school, those dentists will come from Maine and they'll stay in Maine.
Right. So if you had to describe one of the most unique programs that you offer or that your organization provides, what would it be?
I don't know that I could talk about unique. I think it's very important that we offer our CEUs all over the state. That
You had
gives
talked to me a
social
little bit
workers.
about one right before the show started that caught my interest with the gentleman in Portland.
Oh, we have an LGBT committee. Thank you. Yes, we have an LGBT committee, and it's run by Franklin Brooks, and he's, I think, the lifetime chair of this committee. And what's great is that they meet every month in person in Frank's office, but if you are a therapist in another part of the state and you want to be involved in that committee, you call in. So there's a telephone that's in the
So
meeting.
this isn't for clients, it's for professionals.
It's for professionals, and it's critically important because there are lots of places in Maine where there are therapists who are getting clients who are in the LGBT community, and they don't quite know how to deal with the problems their clients are presenting. They're not used to it. A great example of that would be getting a transgender youth in middle school, and somebody getting that for a client and saying, I have someone who biologically presents as a boy, is dressing as a girl, wants to be a girl, wants to be in transition, either does or doesn't have a supportive family. Help, what do I do? And Frank's group not only will make referrals so that somebody in his group ends up possibly seeing this client, but also if that's not possible, they will coach therapists through dealing with a client who is in LGBT, whether they're transitioning from one gender to another. We've worked on legislation around this in the past. It's been kind of an interesting thing. This year, the most controversial thing we worked on, and we just did testimony for it, was the bill that said that people who were picked up for prostitution but were coerced into it could get their records expunged. And that was a really important
So you were
thing
involved
to
with
us.
that?
Yes, we were, because we have a national position on that, which is that if somebody is forced into prostitution, why should they be the person who ends up with a criminal record? And so there has to be a way of saying either I was forced into it, or if they had a drug abuse problem and they had a pimp providing them with drugs, maybe causing their drug abuse problem, that they could get their record expunged if they wanted to change their lives. They can go back to a judge.
That's great. We have 15 seconds left. I'm a social worker. Why should I join NASW?
Because of the work we're doing politically and because we're going to offer you a lot of interesting CEUs.
All right. Well, Susan Lamb, Executive Director of the Maine chapter of National Association of Social Workers, thank you for being our guest today on Nonprofit Insider.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. With the elections coming up in November, we have invited all three gubernatorial candidates to be on Nonprofit Insider. And next week, we have our first candidate, Elliot Cutler, will be joining us to give his thoughts on nonprofits in Maine. All candidates have been invited, and hopefully all three will accept our invitation. The music appears courtesy of Mike Hubbard. You can find Mike and his music on www.michaelhubbardmusic.com. Check out Mike's website to see where he is playing this weekend. Thanks to Deb Danger, MPI's executive engineer. You can catch Deb on Morning Street, Fridays at 6:30, right here on WMPG. If you know a nonprofit that should be on the show, please email me at npi@davidunger.net. Thank you, and until next week.